In our contemporary era of food influencers and aesthetically pleasing meals designed for social media, the notion of medieval peasants consuming their modest daily fare is rather amusing. Certainly no elaborate plating or trending hashtags back then. While we fret over securing reservations at the latest popular eatery, medieval peasants grappled with the more fundamental concern of having sufficient food to survive the harsh winter months. Yet these individuals were incredibly resourceful. Necessity demanded it. When your sustenance relies directly on the land and every meal presents a "what's available in the larder" scenario, you become exceptionally creative. Unlike today's selective eaters who might reject slightly blemished fruit, medieval peasants utilized everything within reach, and I mean everything. Their methods ranged from grinding acorns into flour during periods of scarcity to transforming week-old vegetables into something edible. Their dietary habits reveal more than just what was on their plates. They demonstrate the resilience and adaptability people exhibit when survival is paramount. And believe me, they required those survival skills, particularly when it came to their daily bread, which was far removed from the light, airy loaves we know today. Because while you might consider bread a simple staple, medieval peasant bread would likely cause contemporary health food enthusiasts to blanch. Forget artisanal sourdough. Peasants were typically limited to what historians refer to as maslin bread, a blend of whatever grains they could procure. And when I say whatever, I mean whatever. Recent analyses of medieval bread remnants have uncovered traces of peas, beans, and even pulverized tree bark. Talk about a high-fiber diet. The appearance wasn't exactly suited for Instagram either. Instead of the golden brown loaves we're accustomed to, peasant bread was often dark, dense, and possessed a weight comparable to a brick. In fact, there's a curious historical account from a medieval court detailing a peasant who was actually charged with assault using a loaf of bread, and the judge found the accusation credible, precisely because these loaves served as de facto edible weapons. Approximately 80% of a medieval peasant's daily caloric intake was derived from bread. That's equivalent to consuming solely sandwiches for every meal, albeit without the desirable fillings in between. And the quality, there was a clear distinction. Nobility enjoyed fine white bread made from wheat, while peasants were relegated to what was sometimes called horse bread. Yes, it was so coarse that it was originally intended for horses. Regulations regarding grain were quite stringent as well. Peasants were required to have their grain milled at the Lord's mill and compensate him for the service. Attempting to circumvent this rule could lead to swift and unpleasant consequences. Faster than you could utter boutique bakery, some resourceful peasants reportedly attempted to grind their grain in secret using hand mills. But if apprehended, the repercussions extended beyond a mere reprimand with a rolling pin. During periods of poor harvests, which occurred with regrettable frequency, peasants had to employ inventive measures. They would incorporate pea flour, bean flour, and occasionally even ground acorns. It signifies challenging times when you're competing with squirrels for sustenance. However, here's a particularly intriguing detail. Some food historians have recreated medieval peasant bread recipes, and apparently the acorn version is surprisingly palatable. Though personally, I'll stick to my modern bread, thank you very much. While bread formed the cornerstone of their diet, peasants possessed another clever strategy for maximizing their ingredients, a dish known as pottage. This was the medieval peasant's rendition of an everything-but-the-kitchen-sink soup. This wasn't your grandmother's comforting chicken noodle. Pottage was more akin to a perpetual stew that continuously evolved. You know how some people maintain a living sourdough starter for years? Well, peasants did something similar with pottage, except they kept it going for weeks or even months at a time. The daily cooking ritual typically involved taking whatever vegetables were available, commonly peas, beans, turnips, and if they were fortunate, some cabbage. The true brilliance of pottage lay in its waste-nothing approach. Stale bread from the previous day, toss it in. Dried peas that had been sitting around since the last harvest, if they had them, they went in too. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of clearing out your refrigerator before going on vacation, except they did this every single day. During Lent, the church prohibited the consumption of meat, but medieval peasants were masters of finding loopholes. They might spot a beaver swimming in the river and reason, well, it spends most of its time in water. It must be a fish. The next thing you knew, beaver tail pottage was on the menu. Medieval problems often required medieval solutions, wouldn't you agree? The thing about pottage was its forgiving nature. It was virtually impossible to overcook, as it was intended to be a mushy consistency anyway. If only all cooking were so undemanding. Medieval recipe writers didn't even bother with precise measurements. It was all about adding a handful of this, or throw in whatever you've got. First-time cooks would have found it delightfully simple. While pottage was the daily standard, there was another food source that peasants could usually rely on: fish. And you might find it hard to believe, but a medieval peasants' fishing expedition bore little resemblance to a relaxing modern weekend hobby. The church mandated abstaining from meat for almost half the year, totaling around 150 days. However, fish was permissible, a religious loophole that often benefited peasants. This rule inadvertently helped many peasants avoid malnutrition, even if they weren't consciously aware of its nutritional significance at the time. Yet the true stars of medieval waterways weren't your conventional fish. Eels were the medieval equivalent of fast food. Archaeological excavations have uncovered eel bones in practically every medieval waste disposal site. These slippery creatures were so ubiquitous that some peasants actually used them to pay their rent. Records indicate one village was required to supply its lord with 82,000 eels annually. Talk about a slippery situation. The fishing techniques employed were quite unconventional. Some peasants utilized structures called kittles, which were essentially large wooden mazes built in rivers designed to trap fish. Others engaged in night fishing using spears and torches, a scene that likely resembled a sort of medieval rave party. The truly ingenious individuals trained cormorants, those dark-feathered water birds with long necks, to catch fish for them, though this practice was more common in Asia than in Europe. One particularly humorous fishing method involved using fermented rye. The fish would consume it, become inebriated, and float to the surface. Medieval peasants essentially pioneered the concept of drunk fishing, although the local lord was probably not amused by them using valuable grain to intoxicate fish. Rivers and streams weren't exclusively for fishing either. They served as medieval refrigerators. Peasants would store their dairy products in cool streams during the summer. Occasionally, they would lose their cheese to a particularly ambitious fish, a scenario that sounds like it belongs in a medieval cartoon. The fish market was an adventure in itself. Ever wondered why fish and chip shops are so prevalent in England? Thank medieval peasants. Fish was so vital that roads connecting coastal towns to London were among the first to be properly maintained, specifically to facilitate faster transport of fish to market. They even had what amounted to express lanes for fish delivery. Medieval fast food service, if you will. Of course, if you couldn't catch fish or afford to buy them, there was always another alternative, albeit one that carried considerably more risk and involved potentially antagonizing some very powerful individuals who held firm opinions about who was permitted to hunt what. As mentioned earlier, medieval hunting regulations were more stringent than a helicopter parent supervising a teenage party. Hunting deer or boar was strictly reserved for nobility. Even if a deer wandered into your vegetable garden and began devouring your cabbage, merely touching it could result in severe punishment, quite literally the loss of a hand. The forest laws, enacted by William the Conqueror around 1067, designated vast tracts of England as royal hunting grounds. You weren't even permitted to collect a fallen branch from these forests without authorization. However, peasants demonstrated ingenuity in their interpretations of these laws. Rabbits were not technically protected, so peasant hunting often involved constructing elaborate rabbit traps. They also hunted vermin like hedgehogs and squirrels, not exactly a feast fit for a king, but protein was essential. Recent archaeological studies of peasant waste pits have revealed something interesting: a mix of small animal bones along with larger ones that had been meticulously cracked open. The interpretation? Peasants were extracting and consuming the marrow from virtually every animal they could access. They were also masters of the "it fell off a cart" excuse when suspicious meat somehow appeared in their pottage. The penalties for poaching were severe, however. Speaking of medieval jails, there's a recorded instance of a group of peasants apprehended while poaching a deer. Their defense? The deer had supposedly died of laughter after witnessing one of them slip in the mud. Surprisingly, the judge found this explanation so humorous that he reduced their punishment. Medieval court jesters weren't the only ones with a sense of humor, apparently. Of course, when fresh meat wasn't a viable option, legally or illegally, peasants could always fall back on something a bit more commonplace but still nourishing. Most peasants had access to milk through their village's communal cow. Yes, this was a recognized practice. These community cows functioned as the medieval version of a coffee shop where everyone would go to obtain their daily milk supply. Records from one English village indicate they managed to obtain about 2 to 3 gallons of milk per day from their shared cow, which had to be distributed among 15 families. Talk about meticulously rationing every drop. But fresh milk was generally considered suitable only for children. Adults consuming plain milk were viewed as being as peculiar as wearing socks with sandals today. Why? Without refrigeration, milk spoiled faster than gossip spreads in a small town. Instead, peasants transformed it into cheese and butter, nature's inherent methods for extending milk's shelf life. Cheese making was a serious undertaking. Archaeological excavations have unearthed specialized ceramic containers with perforations, medieval cheese strainers. And what's amusing is that these strainers were frequently inscribed with prayers. Apparently, medieval peasants believed that producing cheese without encountering scientific anomalies required divine intervention. Speaking of divine intervention, butter production had its own complexities. The church actually prohibited butter consumption during Lent in some regions, but not in others. This disparity led to the issuance of butter letters, official documents from the Pope granting permission to use butter during Lent. Some ingenious German peasants circumvented this restriction by asserting that butter was not food, but rather medicine. Doctor's orders, I must consume this butter. Medieval peasants also pioneered the ultimate cheese storage technique. They would age their cheese in abandoned mines where the temperature remained consistently cool. Some of these cheese caves are still in use today. Tests have shown that these caves maintain the perfect temperature and humidity for aging cheese. Those peasants truly understood what they were doing. But preserving dairy products wasn't their sole challenge. The real difficulty lay in finding something safe to use for washing it all down. Because drinking water wasn't always the healthiest choice, water in medieval times was about as reliable as a merchant evading taxes. Rivers often served as open sewers, and wells were frequently contaminated with substances ranging from animal waste to decomposing materials you'd rather not contemplate. One medieval text explicitly warns that drinking water could transform your liver into a sponge. Not precisely scientific, but they weren't entirely incorrect about water posing health risks. Their alternative? Ale, not the strong brews we have today. Medieval ale was more akin to a slightly alcoholic beverage with approximately 1% alcohol content. That's less alcohol than a very ripe banana. Medieval peasants reportedly drank around a gallon of this weak ale per day. Archaeological evidence from medieval cesspits indicates that nearly every household possessed its own ale-making equipment. The brewing process was typically managed by women known as alewives. These women were the original microbrewers, and some gained considerable renown for their recipes. Court records show that some alewives even faced trouble for adding special ingredients to enhance the popularity of their ale. One particularly entrepreneurial alewife was apprehended for adding chicken droppings to make her ale foamy. Medieval quality control wasn't exactly aligned with modern standards. Each village had an ale taster, arguably the best job title in history. These fortunate individuals were tasked with sampling everyone's brew to ensure it met a sufficient standard for sale. They used a special ale tasting cup called a tankard that featured a whistle built into the bottom. When the cup was empty, you could blow the whistle to signal for another round. This is where the phrase "wet your whistle" originates. Scientists have recently recreated medieval ale recipes using archaeological evidence. They discovered that the brewing process inadvertently created a drink rich in vitamins and minerals. The ale was packed with B vitamins from the grain, and the fermentation process made these nutrients more readily absorbed. Medieval peasants accidentally invented the first protein shake, and unlike modern protein shakes, this one came with a mild buzz. But drinking wasn't the only way medieval peasants obtained their daily nutrients. These peasants were serious about incorporating greens into their diet. Berries were the medieval equivalent of fast food, easy to grab and go. Blackberries were so prevalent that they even appear in court records as landmarks. The murder occurred by ye old blackberry bush was apparently a legitimate location description. Peasants even possessed specialized wooden containers designed specifically for berry picking, some of which have survived to the present day. They are essentially medieval Tupperware. Mushroom hunting presented particular challenges. One medieval text lists mushrooms as being the devil's bread, presumably because consuming the wrong variety could hasten your journey to meet him. However, peasants developed clever methods to test mushrooms for safety. They would place a silver spoon in the cooking pot. If it turned black, the mushrooms were deemed poisonous. Not exactly a foolproof test, but certainly better than nothing. Nuts served as the medieval equivalent of protein bars. Archaeological excavations have uncovered massive accumulations of hazelnut shells near peasant homes. We're talking thousands of shells. One site in England contained enough shells to suggest a single family consumed approximately 40 pounds of hazelnuts per year. Medieval CrossFit, anyone? It's intriguing how peasants utilized herbs. They weren't just randomly gathering plants, they possessed extensive knowledge passed down through generations. Recent studies of medieval medical texts indicate that peasants were aware of using garlic for infections and mint for upset stomachs. They were essentially operating a rudimentary pharmacy in their own backyards. However, foraging came with risks beyond encountering poisonous plants. Being caught gathering wood or herbs in the Lord's forest could result in serious trouble. One court record from 1320 documents a woman being fined for picking flowers on church property. Her defense: the Virgin Mary would want her church to look nice, so I was picking weeds. A valiant attempt at medieval maneuvering. The most positive aspect of foraging was how it fostered community bonding. Children were taught from an early age which plants were safe to eat, transforming plant identification into a kind of medieval scouting badge. Even today, some of the plants medieval peasants gathered, such as dandelion and nettles, are experiencing a resurgence in popularity in upscale restaurants. Those peasants were simply ahead of their time, and through all this clever foraging, inventive cooking, and resourceful food acquisition, medieval peasants undeniably demonstrated one key trait. They certainly knew how to make the absolute best of what they had.